In the quiet corridors of mercy, where healing hands work tirelessly to mend broken bodies and shattered spirits, danger can strike without warning. What happens when the very person sworn to save lives must become the shield between innocence and evil? This is the extraordinary true account of Sarah Martinez, a pediatric nurse whose gentle demeanor masked years of military training, and how one terrifying night transformed her from caregiver to guardian angel. When a desperate gunman stormed into Children's Memorial Hospital, believing he could prey upon the vulnerable, he had no idea he was about to face a warrior whose protective instincts ran deeper than any uniform she'd ever worn. Sometimes the most unassuming heroes are forged not in the heat of battle, but in the quiet dedication of service, ready to emerge when darkness threatens the light. Sarah Martinez adjusted her stethoscope around her neck as she walked through the pediatric wing of Children's Memorial Hospital. The familiar sounds of beeping monitors, soft conversations, and occasional laughter from the playroom created a symphony she had grown to love over the past 8 years. At 34, she had become one of the most respected nurses on the floor, known for her gentle touch with frightened children, and her ability to calm anxious parents with just a few reassuring words. The evening shift was always different from the busy chaos of daytime. The hallways grew quieter, the lighting dimmed to help little patients rest, and the pace became more measured. Sarah preferred these hours. There was something peaceful about watching over sleeping children, knowing they felt safe under her care. She checked on Tommy, a 7-year-old recovering from appendix surgery, smoothing his blanket and noting his steady breathing before moving to the next room. What her colleagues and patients didn't know was that Sarah's gentle demeanor was built upon a foundation of steel forged in the mountains of Afghanistan. Before she ever touched a medical chart or administered medication, she had carried an M4 rifle through hostile territory as a combat medic with the Army's 82nd Airborne Division. For 3 deployments spanning nearly 6 years, she had been responsible for keeping soldiers alive under the most extreme conditions imaginable. The transition from military life to civilian nursing hadn't been easy. Sarah had returned home with invisible wounds that took years to heal. The hypervigilance that had kept her alive in combat zones made it difficult to sleep in quiet suburban neighborhoods. The adrenaline that had once surged through her veins during firefights had nowhere to go in peacetime. She found herself jumping at sudden noises, scanning crowds for threats that didn't exist, and struggling to find purpose in a world that seemed impossibly safe compared to where she had been. Was during a particularly dark period, when nightmares kept her awake and civilian life felt hollow, that Sarah discovered pediatric nursing. Something about caring for children spoke to the part of her soul that war had tried to claim. These little ones reminded her why she had fought in the first place. Every child she helped heal represented hope, innocence, and a future worth protecting. The same hands that had once applied battlefield dressings under enemy fire now gently inserted IV lines and offered comfort to scared little patients. Her military training never truly left her, though she kept it carefully hidden beneath her scrubs and warm smile. Sarah still maintained her physical fitness with the same discipline she had learned in the Army. Her apartment contained a small gym where she practiced combat techniques she hoped never to use again. She could still field strip and reassemble a weapon blindfolded, though she hadn't touched a firearm since leaving the service. The tactical awareness that had been drilled into her during countless training exercises remained sharp, even in the peaceful environment of the hospital. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the pediatric attending physician, often commented on Sarah's exceptional performance under pressure. During medical emergencies when other staff members might panic or freeze, Sarah became preternaturally calm. Her movements were precise, her decisions quick and accurate. She had an uncanny ability to anticipate needs before they were voiced and to coordinate complex medical responses with military efficiency. Other nurses looked up to her not just for her clinical skills, but for her unflappable demeanor in crisis situations. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah that she had found her calling in a place dedicated to healing rather than harm. The children she cared for saw only a kind nurse who remembered their favorite stuffed animals and could make even the scariest procedures seem manageable. Parents trusted her implicitly with their most precious possessions. She had become exactly what she had always wanted to be, a protector of the innocent. On this particular Tuesday evening in October, Sarah was assigned to the night shift supervisor role. The pediatric wing housed 42 young patients, ranging from newborns in the NICU to teenagers recovering from various surgeries and treatments. Her team consisted of 6 other nurses, 2 resident doctors, and a handful of support staff. The hospital's main security guard, Mike Rodriguez, made regular rounds but spent most of his time in the lobby and emergency department areas. As Sarah completed her rounds, she mentally cataloged the layout of her domain. Room 314 held Emma, a 4-year-old cancer patient who was finally showing signs of improvement after months of chemotherapy. Her parents had gone home to shower and sleep in their own bed for the first time in weeks, trusting Sarah's promise to call immediately if anything changed. In room 318, the Rodriguez twins were recovering from a car accident that had left them with broken bones, but thankfully no permanent damage. Their grandmother sat vigil between their beds, rosary beads clicking softly as she prayed. The old habits died hard. Even in this environment of healing, Sarah found herself noting exit routes, potential choke points, and defensive positions. She observed which windows could be opened, where medical equipment might provide cover, and how long it would take security to respond to different areas of the wing. These thoughts came unbidden, automatic responses to years of training that had saved her life and the lives of others countless times. Her colleagues would have been shocked to know that beneath her cheerful exterior, Sarah was constantly assessing threats and planning responses. When she suggested moving the medication cart to a different position, they assumed it was for efficiency. They didn't realize she was ensuring it wouldn't block her line of sight to the main corridor. When she insisted on keeping certain supply closets well stocked, they thought it was just good preparation. They couldn't have imagined that she was creating potential caches of resources that could be used in an emergency. The evening progressed normally. Sarah administered medications, checked vitals, and comforted a young boy who had awakened from a nightmare about the surgery he would undergo in the morning. She updated charts, coordinated with the night pharmacy for medication delivery, and briefed the resident on call about each patient's status. The familiar routine was soothing. A rhythm of care and compassion that had replaced the harsh tempo of military life. Around 9 o'clock, Sarah was helping feed formula to baby Marcus in the NICU when she heard the elevator chime in the hallway. This wasn't unusual. Family members often arrived at odd hours, desperate to spend time with their sick children despite visiting hour restrictions. The pediatric staff had learned to be flexible with such rules, understanding that parents needed to be close to their little ones during difficult times. What caught Sarah's attention wasn't the sound of the elevator, but the footsteps that followed. There was something wrong with the gait. Too heavy, too purposeful, too aggressive for someone coming to visit a sick child. The footsteps were those of someone with military or law enforcement training, someone who moved with intent rather than the careful shuffle of worried parents navigating an unfamiliar medical environment. Sarah continued feeding baby Marcus while her mind shifted into a state of heightened alertness. She listened carefully as the footsteps moved down the main corridor, noting their direction and pace. They stopped at the nurse's station, where she could hear muffled conversation with Janet, the charge nurse on duty. Something in the tone of voices, urgent, demanding rather than requesting, made the hair on the back of Sarah's neck stand up. Years of combat experience had taught her to trust these instincts. In Afghanistan, the ability to sense when something was wrong often meant the difference between life and death. The same internal alarm system that had warned her of IED threats and ambushes was now screaming that danger had entered her peaceful domain. Sarah gently placed baby Marcus back in his crib and moved toward the NICU window that overlooked the main hallway. What she saw confirmed her worst fears. A man in his early 30s stood at the nurse's station, and despite his attempt to appear casual, everything about him screamed threat. His clothes were rumpled and dirty, suggesting he had been on the run. His hand shook slightly from drugs, fear, or adrenaline. Most tellingly, he kept his right hand pressed against something under his jacket, something that created an unnatural bulge near his waistband. The man was asking questions about patient locations, specifically about children from wealthy families. He wanted to know about security procedures, visiting schedules, and which rooms housed the most vulnerable patients. When Janet tried to deflect his questions citing privacy policies, his demeanor became more aggressive. Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes darted around the corridor, assessing escape routes and potential obstacles. This was a predator who had entered a place of healing with dark intentions. Sarah's military training kicked into high gear as she began formulating a response plan. She couldn't call security. The man was too close to Janet and other staff members. Any sudden movement might precipitate the very violence she hoped to prevent. She needed to assess the full scope of the threat before taking action. Moving carefully to maintain her line of sight, Sarah observed the man's behavior patterns. He was clearly agitated, possibly under the influence of drugs, and becoming increasingly frustrated with Janet's refusal to provide information. When he finally pulled his hand away from his jacket, Sarah's suspicions were confirmed. The grip of the pistol was clearly visible tucked into his waistband. The gentle nurse who sang lullabies to frighten children disappeared. replaced by the combat-tested soldier who had once fought through the streets of Kandahar. Sarah's breathing became controlled and measured. Her heart rate, rather than spiking with fear, settled into the steady rhythm she had learned to maintain under fire. Every muscle in her body prepared for action while her mind calculated angles, distances, and tactical considerations. The children sleeping peacefully in their beds had no idea that evil had walked into their sanctuary. Their parents, trusting in the safety of the hospital, had no way of knowing that their most precious possessions were now in danger. But Sarah knew, and for the first time since leaving the army, she felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. The absolute certainty that she would protect the innocent no matter the cost to herself. She reached for her phone to text a coded message to security while keeping her eyes on the threat. But before she could complete the message, the man's behavior escalated dramatically. He grabbed Janet by the arm and pulled the gun from his waistband, pressing it against her side while speaking in urgent, hushed tones. Other staff members in the area froze, unsure of what they were witnessing. Sarah's military training had taught her that hesitation in such moments could be fatal. The man had escalated from potential threat to active danger, and every second that passed increased the risk to everyone in the pediatric wing. She had to act, and she had to act now, before he moved deeper into the patient areas where children lay sleeping and vulnerable. The warrior beneath the nurse's uniform began to emerge, as Sarah Martinez prepared to become the shield between innocence and evil. Sarah's transformation from caregiver to warrior was instantaneous and complete. The gentle demeanor that had comforted countless children vanished as years of military training flooded back into her consciousness. Her mind shifted into combat mode, processing threats and calculating responses with the precision that had once kept her alive in the mountains of Afghanistan. The gunman, who had introduced himself to Janet as David Kelmer, was clearly in the grip of desperation. Through careful observation, Sarah could see the telltale signs of someone who had reached the end of his rope. His clothes suggested he had been living rough for days. His erratic behavior and the slight tremor in his hands indicated possible drug withdrawal or extreme stress. Most concerning was his intimate knowledge of the hospital layout. This wasn't a random act but a planned operation. As Sarah watched from her concealed position, pieces of Kelmer's motivation began to emerge through his whispered demands to Janet. He was demanding access to specific patients, children from wealthy families whose parents could pay substantial ransoms. His plan was horrifyingly simple. Take a child hostage, escape through the hospital's complex of tunnels and service corridors, and disappear before authorities could respond effectively. What made Kelmer particularly dangerous was his apparent familiarity with the hospital's security protocols. He knew about shift changes, response times, and the locations of security cameras. Sarah suspected he might be a former employee or someone with inside knowledge of the facility. This wasn't the desperate act of someone seeking drugs or money. This was a calculated attempt at kidnapping that had been planned in advance. Janet, to her credit, was trying to delay and deflect without escalating the situation. Years of nursing had taught her how to remain calm under pressure, but nothing in her experience had prepared her for this level of threat. She continued to cite patient privacy policies, while subtly trying to position herself between Kelmer and the patient rooms. Her courage was remarkable, but Sarah knew that good intentions wouldn't be enough to stop an armed predator. The tactical situation was complex. Kelmer had positioned himself at the nurses' station, which gave him control over the main corridor leading to both patient rooms and the primary exit routes. From his location, he could see anyone approaching from the elevator or stairwell areas. The layout that normally facilitated efficient patient care was now working in favor of the threat. Sarah began moving through the pediatric wing, using her knowledge of the hospital's service areas and back corridors. During her years working the night shift, she had learned every corner of the building. She knew which doors could be locked from the inside, which areas had emergency phones, and how to move through the facility without using the main hallways. This knowledge, combined with her military training in urban combat, gave her significant tactical advantages. As she moved, Sarah activated the hospital's silent alarm system from a concealed panel near the pharmacy storage area. This would alert security and law enforcement without triggering audible alarms that might panic Kelmer into immediate violence. However, she knew that response times meant she would be alone for at least 10 to 15 minutes, an eternity when dealing with an armed threat among vulnerable children. The reality of the situation crystallized as Sarah reached a position where she could observe Kelmer more closely. He had forced Janet to provide him with a list of current patients and their room assignments. His particular interest in children from prominent local families confirmed Sarah's worst fears about his intentions. This wasn't just about money. It was about targeting the most vulnerable members of families who could afford substantial ransom payments. Sarah's military experience told her that Kelmer was operating under extreme pressure and likely had a very narrow window for his plan to succeed. This made him both predictable and extremely dangerous. Desperate people with weapons and limited time often made catastrophic decisions when their plans began to unravel. The moment of crisis came when Kelmer demanded that Janet take him to room 3114, where young Emma lay sleeping in her hospital bed. The 4-year-old cancer patient was alone for the first time in months, her exhausted parents finally convinced to go home for a few hours of rest. Emma was weak from chemotherapy, completely defenseless, and represented exactly the kind of high-value target that would serve Kelmer's purposes. Sarah knew she couldn't allow Kelmer to reach Emma's room. Once he had a child as a hostage, the situation would become exponentially more dangerous and difficult to resolve. Children couldn't understand or cooperate with complex rescue scenarios, and their presence would severely limit any tactical response from law enforcement. Moving with the silent efficiency she had learned in special operations training, Sarah positioned herself in an alcove near the supply room that would allow her to intercept Kelmer before he reached the patient rooms. She used her hospital keycard to lock down several corridor doors, effectively channeling Kelmer's route toward her position while creating barriers that would slow his escape. The supplies available to her were limited but sufficient. A hospital environment contained numerous items that could be weaponized by someone with proper training. Medical gas canisters could serve as makeshift clubs. Cleaning chemicals could create disorienting clouds if mixed properly. Most importantly, the crash cart position near her location contained emergency medications that could incapacitate a threat if administered correctly. Sarah's hands moved with practiced efficiency as she prepared for confrontation. Years of combat medicine had taught her exactly how much sedative would be needed to neutralize a grown man quickly without causing permanent harm. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was preparing to use medical knowledge not to heal, but to protect those who needed healing. As Kelmer forced Janet down the corridor toward Emma's room, Sarah stepped out of her concealment. Her appearance was so sudden and unexpected that both Janet and Kelmer froze momentarily. To them, she was just another nurse who had appeared at the worst possible moment. They had no way of knowing they were looking at a decorated combat veteran who had survived 3 tours in active war zones. Sarah's voice, when she spoke, carried an authority that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her soul. Years of leading soldiers under fire had taught her how to project command presence, even in the most chaotic situations. She didn't shout or threaten. She simply spoke with the absolute certainty of someone who had faced death and emerged victorious. "Let her go," Sarah said quietly, addressing Kelmer directly while keeping her hands visible and non-threatening. "Whatever you're planning, this isn't the way to do it." Kelmer's reaction was immediate and violent. He swung the pistol towards Sarah while maintaining his grip on Janet. His eyes were wild with the desperation of someone whose carefully laid plans had suddenly encountered an unexpected obstacle. In his mind, Sarah was just another hospital employee who had stumbled into his operation at the wrong time. "Stay back," Kelmer shouted, his voice cracking with stress. "I'll kill her. I'll kill both of you." But Sarah had heard such threats before, screamed by insurgents in life-or-death situations. She had learned to read the difference between someone who was willing to kill and someone who was simply trying to control a situation through intimidation. Kelmer's body language told her he was desperate but not yet committed to lethal violence. This gave her a narrow window of opportunity. "You don't want to hurt anyone," Sarah continued, taking a small step forward. "You're looking for something specific and violence isn't going to get it for you. Let's talk about what you really need." Her approach was textbook hostage negotiation combined with the psychological warfare techniques she had learned in military interrogation training. By acknowledging Kelmer's desperation while refusing to show fear, she was attempting to establish herself as someone who might be able to help him rather than simply another obstacle to overcome. Janet, meanwhile, was demonstrating remarkable composure under extreme stress. She remained still and calm, recognizing that Sarah was trying to diffuse the situation through dialogue. Her nursing experience had taught her how to read people under pressure, and something in Sarah's demeanor suggested she knew exactly what she was doing. Kelmer's grip on his weapon wavered slightly as Sarah continued talking. Her tone was conversational, almost friendly, as if they were discussing a minor hospital policy rather than a life-threatening situation. This unexpected approach was confusing him, disrupting the mental script he had prepared for this moment. "I know you've been planning this for a while," Sarah said, taking another small step forward. "You know the hospital layout, the security procedures, the shift schedules." "That takes intelligence and patience. Someone with your skills doesn't need to hurt innocent people to get what they want." The compliments were deliberate, designed to appeal to Kelmer's ego while simultaneously buying time for backup to arrive. Sarah could hear sirens in the distance, still minutes away, but getting closer. Every second she could delay Kelmer's progress toward the patient rooms was a victory. But Kelmer was too desperate and too unstable to be completely controlled through words alone. His original plan had called for quick action and immediate escape. The longer this confrontation continued, the more likely it became that his window of opportunity would close completely. "Shut up!" he screamed, pressing the gun more firmly against Janet's side. "You don't know anything about what I need. Where are the rich kids? Where are the families with money?" This outburst confirmed Sarah's assessment of Kelmer's motivations and mental state. He was operating under extreme financial pressure, probably facing threats from creditors or criminal associates. In his desperation, he had convinced himself that kidnapping a child from a wealthy family was his only way out of whatever hole he had dug for himself. Sarah's military training had taught her that desperate enemies were often the most dangerous because they had nothing left to lose. But it had also taught her that desperation could be used against an opponent if approached correctly. Desperate people made mistakes, took unnecessary risks, and often abandoned sound tactical thinking in favor of emotional reactions. "The families with money have private security," Sarah lied smoothly. "Armed guards, both here and at home. You take one of their kids, you're not just dealing with police, you're dealing with professional contractors who don't follow the same rules." The seed of doubt she planted was deliberate and strategic. Kelmer had clearly planned this operation, based on the assumption that hospital security would be minimal and that wealthy families would be willing to pay quickly rather than risk their children's safety. By introducing the possibility of armed private security, Sarah was forcing him to recalculate his entire approach. Kelmer's eyes darted toward the patient room doors, then back to Sarah and Janet. She could see his mind racing, trying to process this new information and determine whether it changed his tactical situation. The doubt was growing, but so was his desperation. "You're lying," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're just trying to stop me." "Room 314, Sarah said quietly. "Emma Patterson, 4 years old, cancer patient. Her father owns Patterson Industries downtown. You think a man worth $50 million doesn't have his daughter protected?" It was a calculated risk. Precedent. Sarah was revealing that she knew which child Kelmer was targeting, but she was also reinforcing the idea that his plan was flawed from the beginning. Emma's father wasn't actually worth $50 million. He was a middle-class insurance adjuster, but Kelmer had no way of knowing that in the moment. The psychological pressure was working. Kelmer's confidence in his plan was eroding, replaced by uncertainty and growing panic. This was exactly the mental state Sarah had been hoping to create. Confused, off balance, and increasingly likely to make the kind of mistakes that would give her the opening she needed. That opening came when Kelmer made the fatal error of looking away from Sarah toward Emma's room, trying to assess whether he could see any signs of additional security. In that instant of divided attention, Sarah moved with the lightning speed and precision that had once saved her life in combat zones across 2 continents. The confrontation was about to become physical, and the gentle nurse was about to show the gunman exactly what kind of warrior he had chosen to threaten. The moment Kelmer's attention wavered, Sarah struck with the precision and speed of a trained killer. Years of hand-to-hand combat training exploded into action as she closed the distance between them in 2 swift steps. Her first move was a classic disarmament technique, a sharp strike to Kelmer's wrist that sent the pistol clattering across the hospital floor while simultaneously grabbing Janet and pulling her away from the gunman. Kelmer's shock at the sudden violence was complete. In his mind, he had been threatening a nurse, someone who would be naturally frightened and compliant when faced with an armed threat. The last thing he had expected was to find himself in a hand-to-hand combat situation with someone who moved like a professional fighter. Sarah's military training had covered extensive close-quarters combat scenarios, including disarming armed opponents in confined spaces. The hospital corridor provided enough room for her to maneuver while limiting Kelmer's options for escape or counterattack. Every movement she made was calculated to maintain control of the situation while minimizing the risk to nearby patients and staff. Kelmer stumbled backward, reaching desperately for the fallen weapon, but Sarah was already moving to kick it further down the hallway. Her positioning kept her between Kelmer and both the gun and the patient room doors. Even in the heat of combat, her primary concern remained protecting the children who lay sleeping just meters away. The physical confrontation that followed was brief but intense. Kelmer was larger and stronger than Sarah, but he lacked her training and experience in actual combat situations. His movements were wild and uncoordinated, driven by panic rather than technique. Sarah, by contrast, fought with the cold efficiency of someone who had engaged enemy fighters in life-or-death situations. When Kelmer lunged toward her, Sarah used his momentum against him, executing a perfect hip throw that sent him crashing into the corridor wall. The technique was one she had practiced thousands of times during military training, but this was the first time since leaving the army that she had used it in actual combat. Muscle memory and years of conditioning took over as she maintained control of the situation. Janet, meanwhile, had reached the nurses' station and activated every alarm system available. The pediatric wing suddenly filled with the controlled chaos of emergency response as additional staff members emerged from various rooms and departments. But rather than rushing to help, most of them hung back, recognizing that they were witnessing something far beyond their experience or training. Dr. Jennifer Walsh appeared from the on-call room where she had been resting between patient rounds. Her first instinct was to rush forward and help, but she stopped short when she saw the scene unfolding before her. The gentle nurse she had worked with for years had transformed into something completely different. A warrior engaged in mortal combat to protect her patients. Kelmer managed to regain his footing and made another desperate attempt to reach the fallen weapon. But Sarah anticipated his move and intercepted him with a series of precise strikes designed to disable rather than seriously injure. Her goal was not to hurt Kelmer unnecessarily, but to neutralize him as a threat, while keeping him alive to face justice for his attempted crimes. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder as law enforcement units responded to the silent alarms that had been triggered throughout the hospital. Sarah knew that backup was only minutes away, but she also understood that those minutes represented an eternity when dealing with a desperate armed criminal among vulnerable children. As the physical confrontation continued, Sarah found herself drawing on memories and skills she had hoped never to use again. The controlled violence that had once been her profession in Afghanistan was now her tool for protecting innocent children in a pediatric hospital. The irony was not lost on her that the same hands that had once dealt death were now fighting to preserve life. Kelmer's desperation reached a crescendo when he realized that his carefully planned operation had completely unraveled. His escape routes were blocked, his weapon was out of reach, and he was facing an opponent whose skills far exceeded anything he had anticipated. In his panic, he made one final attempt to reach the patient rooms, apparently hoping to grab a child as a human shield. This was the moment Sarah had been preparing for since the confrontation began. Allowing Kelmer to reach any of the children was absolutely unacceptable, regardless of the personal cost to herself. She threw herself between him and the room doors with a tackle that would have impressed her old drill instructors, driving them both to the floor in a tangle of limbs and desperate struggle. The final phase of the fight took place on the cold hospital floor, with Sarah using every technique she had learned during years of military service to maintain control over a man who was larger, stronger, and completely desperate. Her advantage lay not in physical strength, but in training, experience, and the absolute certainty that she would not allow harm to come to any child under her protection. When hospital security finally arrived, followed closely by armed police officers, they found Sarah maintaining a textbook restraint hold on Kelmer while speaking quietly into her phone with the emergency dispatcher. Her uniform was torn and she had sustained several minor injuries during the struggle, but her primary concern was ensuring that all patients in the pediatric wing were accounted for and safe. The weapon that Kelmer had brought into the hospital was quickly secured and examined by the responding officers. Investigation would later reveal that it was fully loaded and had been reported stolen from a gun shop several days earlier. The seriousness of the threat that Sarah had neutralized became clear when detectives discovered detailed floor plans of the hospital and Kelmer's car, along with photographs and personal information about several wealthy families whose children had been patients at various times. Dr. Walsh watched in amazement as Sarah transitioned seamlessly from combat mode back to her role as a caring nurse. Within minutes of Kelmer being taken into custody, she was checking on each child in the pediatric wing, ensuring that none of them had been awakened or frightened by the commotion. Her gentle demeanor and soothing voice returned as if the violent confrontation had never happened. Young Emma Patterson, the 4-year-old cancer patient who had been Kelmer's primary target, slept peacefully through the entire incident. When her parents arrived the next morning for their usual visit, they had no idea how close they had come to living every parent's worst nightmare. Sarah saw no reason to burden them with details of what might have been. It was enough that their daughter was safe and continuing her recovery. The hospital administration struggled to process what had happened in their pediatric wing. Sarah's personnel file contained no indication of her military background beyond a brief mention of prior service. The gentle, caring nurse they thought they knew had revealed herself to be a trained warrior capable of incredible violence when protecting those under her care. News media, when they eventually learned of the story, had difficulty reconciling the image of a pediatric nurse with that of a combat veteran who had single-handedly neutralized an armed threat. Sarah herself was reluctant to discuss the incident in detail, preferring to focus on the fact that all the children had remained safe throughout the ordeal. During the investigation that followed, detectives discovered that Kelmer had been planning his hospital operation for months. He had posed as a maintenance worker to gain access to building plans and security procedures. His selection of Children's Memorial Hospital was based on its reputation for treating children from wealthy families, combined with what he perceived as relatively light security compared to other potential targets. The failure of Kelmer's plan had nothing to do with security measures or surveillance systems. It failed because he had encountered something he could never have anticipated, a protector whose skills and determination far exceeded anything he had planned for. His assumption that hospital staff would be easy targets had proven to be catastrophically wrong. In the weeks that followed, Sarah found herself struggling with the aftermath of returning to combat mode after years of peaceful civilian life. The hypervigilance and adrenaline response that had served her well during the crisis now made it difficult to return to normal hospital routines. She found herself constantly scanning for threats that no longer existed, her body unable to fully accept that the danger had passed. The hospital offered counseling services and extended leave, but Sarah chose to continue working. The children in her care needed her, and she found that focusing on their healing helped her process her own internal struggles. The same sense of purpose that had drawn her to pediatric nursing after her military service now helped her cope with having to use violence once again. Her colleagues' attitudes toward her changed dramatically after the incident. The gentle nurse they had worked with for years was now viewed with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. Some found it difficult to reconcile the caring caregiver with the warrior who had emerged during the crisis. Others developed a deeper appreciation for the depth of character and hidden strengths that could exist beneath a quiet exterior. Janet, the charge nurse who had been held at gunpoint, became one of Sarah's strongest supporters. She understood better than anyone else what Sarah had risked to protect the patients and staff of the pediatric wing. The two women developed a bond forged in shared danger and mutual respect that would last for the rest of their careers. The children Sarah cared for remained largely unaware of what had happened that night. To them, she was simply the nice nurse who always remembered their favorite stories and could make scary medical procedures seem less frightening.
This was exactly how Sarah preferred it.
Her role was to be their protector and caregiver, not to burden them with knowledge of the dangers that sometimes threatened their safe space. 6 months after the incident, Sarah received a commendation from both the hospital administration and local law enforcement for her actions that night. The ceremony was small and private. She had insisted that there be no publicity that might frighten current patients or their families. The recognition meant less to her than the knowledge that every child in her care had remained safe when evil had entered their sanctuary. David Kelmer was eventually sentenced to 15 years in prison for attempted kidnapping, assault with a deadly weapon, and numerous other charges. During his trial, the full scope of his planned crimes became clear. He had intended to kidnap multiple children over several months, believing that wealthy families would pay substantial ransoms rather than risk their children's safety. His failure to account for the possibility of encountering trained resistance had doomed his plan from the beginning. Sarah Martinez continued working as a pediatric nurse at Children's Memorial Hospital, where she remained one of the most respected members of the staff. Her experience that October night had reminded her that the warrior she had once been would always be a part of her, ready to emerge when those she had sworn to protect were threatened. The children in her care might see only a gentle caregiver, but beneath her scrubs and warm smile, a guardian stood ready to become their shield against any darkness that might threaten their healing light. The true measure of her victory was not in the violence she had used to stop Kelmer, but in the peaceful sleep of 42 children who had never known they were in danger. In the end, that was all that mattered to the warrior who had chosen healing over harm, but who would never hesitate to fight when innocence needed protection.